So this lesson is going to be on populations, and the learning target is to be able to describe a population using density and population dispersion in your description. So I was driving past a pasture the other day. It was a pretty hot day out, probably 92, 93 degrees, and I was driving past it, and I saw all of this empty space across the entire pasture. But in one corner of the pasture, I saw a tree that was planted. It was about the same size as this, maybe a little bit bigger, but it was right in the corner post. And I saw all of these cows were huddled around this tree, and some were in the shade, some weren't in the shade, but they were just packed into this tight corner up against the barbed wire fence. And I was just laughing because they had the entire pasture to all to themselves, and all they wanted to do, all they were thinking about at that point was getting into the shade. And it was funny how the resources in that pasture affected the behavior and the where the cows were standing so strongly on that hot day. And this type of thinking about the resources in a certain ecosystem or an environment and how that affects the organisms and where we can find these organisms throughout an ecosystem is going to be pretty much the topic of this lesson. Right? So as we look at wolves, they travel in packs. Why do they travel in packs? What is it about wolf packs that cause these animals to live in that way? And as we look at the United States and we look at how our population across the United States is dispersed, across all of our land, why is it that way? Why is it that there's just a little bit up in Alaska, a couple spots where there's people up in Alaska, and why is it that we're so densely populated over here, but over here we have so much empty space? And what is it that causes that? And we're going to apply these same concepts of population and population density to our own ecosystems and to be able to analyze that ecosystem. So what is a population? Well, a population is a group of the same species living in an area. Species. It's got to be the same species living in a certain area. So you have these seagulls right here, and you have these fungi living on the side of a tree. But as long as it's the same species living in a certain area, that is a population. So it could be the population of Glenwood, Minnesota, when we talk about that. Well, how many people are there living in Glenwood, Minnesota? We're not talking about how many people, dogs, cats live in Glenwood. We're just talking about the people that live there. Or if we talk about a population of wolves in a certain forest, that's what we're talking about. So the big thing here is it's got to be the same species living in a certain area. The population of Glenwood does not include people from Benson, right? But the population of Minnesota includes both towns. And so it's really important to define what area are we talking about when we're thinking about a population, because that makes a big difference. If we talk about the population in the United States, that's a much different concept than the population of people living in Anchorage, Alaska, right? As opposed to people living in Houston, Texas, right? So we have to define what is the population that we are talking about. And one of the most effective ways we can describe the population of an area is to talk about it in terms of the population density. And this is individuals per unit area or volume. So how many individuals are packed into a certain space? If we think about bears are not super dense in their population. You're never going to see 10 bears all living in a pack together. Some animals do that sort of thing, but bears definitely do not. And it comes down to what their environment is and what their niche is in that environment and what role they play in their environment and how many of this species is going to be able to function in the same environment, in the same ecosystem at the same time. We talked about competitive exclusion in ecosystems and how two organisms can't occupy the same niche for very long in an ecosystem because eventually either one's gonna outcompete the other one, or resources are going to run low. And so you look at bears and they're very solitary, not really living in big packs. And then you look at the people in the United States, you look at New York City, how dense is that population? It's extremely dense. And that's because in that environment, there is a lot of different things and different niches that people can occupy. And so it lends itself to having a very dense population and still being able to provide for all of the people in that environment. We can build bigger skyscrapers for people to live. People can work in different jobs, and we can create new jobs for those people. And so we are adapting that environment to allow for a very dense population. There gets to be a point where we can't adapt as well, or we can't adapt our environment for that dense of a population, and then um, eventually the population won't be able to be as dense and people will start to move other places. But for now, a lot of cities are able to adapt to a growing number of people and be able to have a very dense population because of the constantly changing niche and the ability of humans to adapt our habitat. So you've got to be thinking about how does the niche of that organism and how does the habitat allow for a certain population density in that ecosystem. And so as we try to describe the population apart from the population density, we can also talk about the population dispersion, which has an effect on the density. So there's three main ways that we're going to be able to describe that as clumped, random, and uniform. And so the first one is clumped, where we have certain groups of organisms around in a little pack. You could think of this like a wolf pack or something like that. This reminds me of the cows that were all clumped up underneath the tree. And this could be due to patchy resources. So we have a pack of wild dogs right here. They travel in packs maybe to more effectively hunt or communicate with each other or to protect each other or whatever it is. This could be because they can all feed off the same kill, but they might need each other to take down an animal. Maybe they're hunting, I don't know where they're at, like an antelope or something, and they're going to take one down, but they need the entire pack to do it, and they can all feed off of that resource once they kill that animal. Or, this could be clumped because of all those cows there was a limited amount of shade in that pasture, and so they all clumped around that shady spot and trying to get into the shade. And so this is usually from patchy resources in that area, which would cause a clumped dispersion. The next type is the random dispersion, and this is kind of tricky with animals especially. This could happen a lot of times with plants where they are, giving off seeds in a random way. Maybe where, like dandelions, they give off seeds where the seeds are going to go wherever the wind takes them, and so they could be pretty random. Now, right now, if you look at it from a big scale right here, it could look like it's pretty uniform across the entire field. But as you look a little bit closer, you might see that these are a little bit more random than you would have normally thought. We have, a few growing all from right here. We have one right here. We have one here. We have one over here. We got a bunch over here. And as you outline these, they might look a little bit more random, but if you zoomed out, they would look pretty uniform. And so this is mostly from when individuals are not interacting very strongly. The dandelions aren't interacting with each other very strongly. And so they're able to have a more random dispersion. And then we also have uniform, where the individuals are evenly spaced from each other. And this could be when an individual is competing for a scarce environmental resource, or like for these penguins right here, they are hatching eggs. And so what they're doing is they're spreading out among all of this area so that they keep each other away from those eggs, and they protect that their space. And so this is when individuals are competing for scarce environmental resources. And so this could be something like, I don't know, maybe like an apex predator would be in this uniform dispersion, or something like these penguins when they are trying to hatch eggs. And so these are the three different ways that we can describe our population dispersion. And this is going to give us a much clearer definition of what a population in an ecosystem looks like. And when we combine this with population density, that's going to give us a really good idea of what types of resources we have and how these organisms are interacting with their environment. If we know that organisms are in a clumped distribution, we can think, okay, what resources are they after that are causing them to clump up like this? Or what interactions are causing them to clump up like this? Or if we see that organisms are randomly dispersed, we could see, okay, how are they becoming dispersed, and what resources are they after, and what interactions are causing them to be dispersed or randomly, or what interactions are not there that would cause them to have a certain distribution. If they're random, they're not interacting very strongly. And then if we look at uniform, we could think, what resources are they after, and what interactions are causing them to be spread out amongst this entire space? And so we can really identify those interactions. And so being able to classify the population dispersion of these organisms is really going to help us to better understand the interaction that these organisms have with their environment, with other organisms in that environment. So the goal of this video is to be able to understand what the population density is and to be able to connect these types of population distributions into different situations. So being able to come up with an idea for why that population distribution is in that state. So remember that population density is the number of individuals in a certain area or volume. A lot of individuals in a certain space, very high density. If you have something spread out like a bear, where there's only a few every maybe few square miles, then you have a very low population density, and that's going to tell you something about the resources and that type of organism and how it interacts with its environment. And you should also be able to come up with a situation and identify why that population distribution is showing up and what's causing that.